Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
To the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I hope you are having a wonderful Tuesday, that you had a wonderful weekend. Maybe the sun was shining where you were. If it wasn't, I hope that at least you were getting some good rain and not snow, depending on where you are. But I hope you had a good weekend, regardless of what the weather may or may not have been doing where you were. I am excited to welcome another author to the podcast. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, today I am speaking with author Rob Swigart about his book, Mixed Harvest, Stories from the Human Past. This is an interesting book to try to categorize because there's history, there's anthropology, there's historical fiction, it's short stories. There's a lot of different genres happening in this book. Rob says at one point during the interview that he likes to think of it as a novel, and in some ways it really does read like a novel, but it also defies one specific genre, I think, in order to categorize it. Let me go ahead and read the back of the book for you, and maybe you can decide what you think the genre is. In Unforgettable Stories of the Human Journey, a combination of storytelling and dialogue underscore an excavation into the deep past of human development and its consequences. Through a first encounter between a Neanderthal woman and the modern human she called Traveler, to the emergence and destruction of the world's first cities, Mixed Harvest tells the tale of the Sedentary Divide, the most significant event since modern humans emerged. Rob Swigart's latest work humanizes the rapid transition to agriculture and pastoralism with a grounding in the archaeological record. There is also a quote by Joey Eschrich of Arizona State University that says, "Mixed Harvest is an unexpected take on human origins and early human societies, blending deftly written short stories with brief nonfiction segments. Readers will leave with a strong emotional grounding in the anthropological and archaeological record, and a large number of informational and thematic touch points for understanding this history." So maybe that gives you a little more of an idea of what this collection of short stories is about. As Rob says, as I mentioned earlier, Rob says in the interview, he does think of it kind of as a novel, and it does in some ways read that way, although not fully. The brief nonfiction portions of the book are included in each chapter or in each short story, however you want to think of those sections. They are, as I said, brief. They are kind of touch points to that story, connecting the history, the archaeology, the anthropology, etc., to the characters or the events of that short story or that chapter. So I am going to go ahead now and let Rob explain more about this book. I'll let you decide maybe what genre it fits in best in your own brain, and we'll go from there. So again, the book is called Mixed Harvest, Stories from the Human Past, and the author is Rob Swigart.
Hi, Rob. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. How are you, Sarah?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Also well. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm very happy to have you here to talk about your new book, Mixed Harvest, Stories from the Human Past. Before we get to the book, though, if you would share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
All right. Midwest. After graduate school, moved to California, where I taught at the university. I was originally starting in graduate school a poet and doing reasonably well as a poet, but as most people know, poetry well as fiction. And I guess it's funny to say that I was assigned a beginning creative writing class, which meant I had to write fiction. And so I did that just to get in practice. And that ended up as my first book, which was really kind of an overnight success, which is always dangerous for a writer. But it started a career which has not stopped. And I switched from poetry to fiction. Along the way, I was also a journalist, a computer game designer, a technical writer, a futurist, and an archaeology writer, because that was an interest of mine from the beginning. And I think that Mixed Harvest is kind of the culmination of all of that. So now I'm retired from teaching and a full-time writer.
Well, first, I love that you were assigned a class that kind of switched your focus a little bit, and so it took you on a different path and got you writing a book. That, many, many steps in between led us here today. And then I also love how diverse your interests are, but how they really do all kind of coalesce in this latest book that you have written. So again, it's called Mixed Harvest, Stories from the Human Past. Can you give an overview of the book?
Mixed Harvest came out of a series of meetings in Turkey in the around 2009 to 2011, which were, I had done an archaeology textbook novel called Stone Mirror, Story of the Neolithic, which I can get into in some depth, but because of that, I had been a novelist in residence at a place called Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, a Neolithic settlement site. And when we got to the conferences, it was a series. Every year we had a meeting. And the subject was supposed to be the role of religion in the origin of the city. But I thought if we're going to talk about the role of religion in the origin of the city, and the topic became much larger than that, I thought it was also important that we understand how we got to the Neolithic, which meant discussing the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and perhaps a little bit of what happened after the Neolithic. And the Neolithic, to me, was a period when we adopted agriculture, and that's the biggest transition in human history. And that includes prehistory. So when we adopted agriculture, we changed not only the world around us, but we changed ourselves in fundamental, physical, genetic ways. And it seemed to me so dramatic that I really wanted to understand how we got there and what we went through and what we can do about the unintended consequences of our adoption of agriculture, which means, what we've got today: climate change, pollution, inequality, war, plague, and lots of other fairly negative consequences. So it seemed to me that what I wanted to do was write a book that would cover that period, which is admittedly quite long, and perhaps point to some ways of thinking about it so that we can make better decisions about what we do going forward. And I had done a job, a small task for a think tank about climate change in the early 2000s. And I got kind of obsessed with the topic. So looking at what happened during this period between about 12,000 years ago and say 6,000 years ago, when we radically changed the world. meant figuring out what happened before it, because we spent a couple of 100,000 years, maybe more like closer to 300,000 years, being hunter-gatherers, wandering around, following the food, low population, low impact on the world, but a vast accumulation of natural history wisdom, which we have unfortunately pretty much lost since we started building roads and cities. That's a long introduction to what the book is. I wanted to illustrate the facts of the story with short stories that would be emotionally engaging so that we could get a sense of what it felt like to be a hunter-gatherer, to encounter a Neanderthal, to go into a cave and the deepest recesses of the cave and paint something on the ceiling or the wall by flickering animal fat lamp light. And so that's how the stories emerged. I guess I'll answer one of your other questions, which is the book originally was twice as big, and half of it was factual material and half of it was short story. And along the way, I decided to cut most of the factual information and just provide a little bit of a casing for each story to situate it in time and the level of cultural context for each one, so that I could tell the story in a series of short stories. The publisher initially was calling it a novel, so I'm going to pretend it's a kind of novel. And that's how Mixed Harvest came about.
It's interesting that you say that you're going to pretend it's a kind of novel, because it does defy genre a little bit. I mean, it is short stories, but there is there are some recurring characters in those short stories, and there's an arc. There's definitely an arc throughout it, but it's also got the nonfiction elements. So it's a little bit hard to categorize, which is just fine. I like things that cross genres. When you were putting together, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, as you can imagine, it presented a challenge finding a publisher, because the word hybrid kept coming up, and for some reason hybrids are considered bad.
Which I don't get, because they're becoming much more common in the book world.
Absolutely, and in animal husbandry, hybrids are where the vigor is. So
right.
I'd like to think that this is a vigorous book.
That's a good way to think of it. When you were putting together the timeline, the outline for the book, did you start with some of the story ideas, or did you start with some of the factual stuff? How did you put together the touch points for each story and its place in history?
I spent a lot of time doing research for it. Obviously, a lot of it is reading. I read a lot of stuff about prehistory, but some of it was actually going into caves and looking at the cave paintings and visiting some of the sites that I talk about. I went to Israel. I went to a couple of parts of Turkey. I went all over northern Spain and France, particularly for the caves. And I did not go to Iraq to study the Sumerian stuff. That's out of books. But that's because there was a lot of fighting going on. In the last time I was in Turkey was very close to the Syrian border. And I don't know how dangerous it was, but we didn't go there. I wanted to do the prehistory, and that meant I just arbitrarily picked Europe as a place. It's probably the second or third migration of Homo sapiens out of East Africa that went into Europe. The first one, it seems, went to Australia and Indonesia, that part of the world, which has a different set of mythologies and a different kind of culture. But I was sticking kind of with Europe and the Near East because that's where agriculture emerged. And of course, that's where I was invited to partake. But it seems to me that the story can be retold with very similar outlines in Asia or even in the Americas. Agriculture emerged everywhere kind of on its own. So we have to expect that it's an emergent property of the species and not something we could have chosen. But if we had the knowledge we have now, we probably could have made better decisions about how we did it. On a lot of what Çatalhöyük has is a very dense concentration of dwellings, of habitations. They're about 25 square meters. There's cells that you enter through the roof, like a pueblo. Very, very concentrated human community. Not very comfortable. The cell, I call them cells, were full of smoke because there was a hearth and a fireplace, an oven in each building. And they were built right next to each other. So people walked across the roof to get to their house. So the house became a very important central character in the study of that location. And I thought, well, what is a house? Besides a place to live, it's an extension of the body. And a lot of the anthropologists on the project were discussing that as the extension of the human body. It has ingress and outgress and windows that can look out onto the surroundings and so on. So it seems to be a little bit like a body. And so where did we live before that? And I picked the word shelter to describe the first section of the book. So I was thinking about, where people lived and how they lived. And shelter is not a permanent place. It's a temporary structure, if it's a structure at all. And then we developed houses, and then houses became homes. Civilization took over. The city took over, and we gradually separated ourselves from what we now call the natural world. And so that was the arc of the book, beginning with wandering around the landscape, encountering others of similar culture and possibly similar language, and then settling down, being semi-permanent, and then being completely permanent with agriculture tied to a city. And I think that the consequences of that process have been glorious on one hand and very negative on the other hand. So it's a mixed harvest.
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast, but that gives you a better idea of what this book is about, what Rob was hoping for with the writing of it, the origin of the name, Mixed Harvest, etc. Stay tuned. When we come back, we'll be speaking about Rob's statement that he is interested in humans' effect on the earth and how that plays into this particular collection of short stories. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Rob Swigart. Again, we are talking about his new book, Mixed Harvest, Stories from the Human Past. Let's go ahead and return now to that interview.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned in a prior conversation over email that you were interested in the consequences of human impact on Earth, and of course we're dealing with that a lot now with discussions around climate change. And it's interesting because you talk about the relationship between humans and animals, and when animals start becoming domesticated, and then they're dependent on humans, and we're dependent on them, and it's the whole. That's a huge change. So you say knowing our history allows us to make more informed decisions, but are we?
Yes.
And that's a very good question, and I'm not sure I would know quite how to answer that. I mean, my initial reaction is not really, but I would love to hear what you say to that.
That was my initial reaction too. I was. It's even a bit depressing looking into this. But since the early 2000s when I did that project then it was global warming, I was getting increasingly alarmed. And then the rate at which we are exceeding the capacity of the planet to support us is now, let's see, I just heard this yesterday. I'll approximate. There is a date during the year when we exceed the capacity of the planet to regenerate what we have extracted from it. And that date is now, last year was in August. So we are not sustainable. But I was in a little seminar about evolution with an anthropologist at Princeton, and he treats the city like just another ecosystem. And it doesn't seem to be bothering people that we're paving over everything. I think I'm reading now a lot of books about what I think are going to have to be post-capitalist economics, where we don't look at the GDP as something that always has to increase, because we're exceeding. We are not supporting all the people we have adequately, and we are exceeding the capacity of the planet. So we either make good decisions now or we don't survive. I'm hoping we will survive. But pretty much everything I write these days is one way or another about this.
Well, one thing I find fascinating with your approach to all of this is how interconnected it is. I think so often in a former career, we called it siloing, where everything was in its own little space. Yeah. But that's not always helpful because there needs to be communication. And so the fact that you combine archaeology, anthropology, economics, everything within this, I think is really interesting and helpful. Is that something that just evolved naturally for you, or was that introduced to you in some way? How did you discover kind of just combining all of these interests?
I think part of it is that I think the reason I studied literature and became a writer is that I just couldn't settle on any one scientific endeavor that I wanted to stick with, that I would have to narrow my vision to see. I'm just, I told somebody once my totem animal is a terrier, because I'll be digging a hole to bury a bone and see something running across the horizon and drop the bone and run after it. So I guess it's just curiosity. But it's also a lot of accident. And, if I meet somebody who's doing something interesting, I'll probably end up pursuing it a little bit just to get to know it. And that's how I ended up being a futurist. I'd like to do a shout out for This View of Life, which is David Sloan Wilson's project on the internet, which has lots of supporting material and seminars and classes and things that you can explore, because I think initially the application of evolutionary biology and the science of evolution to other fields. So it's completely interdisciplinary, and they're applying it to education, to economics, to sociology, to business. This whole thing about the third way of entrepreneurship. I think it's so appealing to me because it combines everything and it introduces me to new things that I get excited about. So I'm the siloing that you mentioned was probably necessary, but I think its day is over. I don't think it works anymore. People got too specialized, and they lost sight of the big picture. And these are efforts to regain access to the big picture.
Sure. What do you hope readers will take away from the book?
Aside from an entertaining read, because I think the stories are engaging and the characters are interesting, a little bit of a sense of how people lived, how our shared humanity has developed, how we ended up where we are today with all the great things that we have, like a vaccine for COVID, for instance, and the sense that we wouldn't have needed a vaccine for COVID if we hadn't developed a civilization that allowed diseases, what are called zoonotic diseases, to jump from animals to people because we live in such close proximity with them. We get benefits, and sometimes they're responses to the downsides of what we've done before. They're called remedial technologies. If you invent the wall to keep out the wind, it does a great job keeping out the wind, but you can't see what kind of predators are roaming around out there. So you have to create a window. And if you create a window, then the wind comes in, so you have to create a covering for the window, and so on, and so on. So those remedial technologies are also always answers to the previous problems created by the previous technology. And we now have such a complicated technological ecosystem that we're creating problems we don't know about yet and solving yesterday's problems instead of anticipating tomorrow's. And maybe we're hoping that with AI and other technologies, we will get ahead of it, but I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. You just described a really adult, scary version of if you give a mouse a cookie. I feel like.
You got it.
Yeah. I had a question. It popped out of my head. Give me just a second as I tried. I'm always fascinated by writers' approach to characters, and your characters, of course, are historical fiction characters. So when you're going so far back in history and writing about characters that aren't maybe as well known as a more modern character, how do you flesh out those characters and choose names, do all of those fun character development processes?
Well, choosing the names is fun. For the Middle East, I often choose Basque names because there's a linguist named Greenberg who thinks that Navajo might be descended from Basque. There are little pockets of Basque-like languages all the way along the Silk Road into Eastern Asia. And I don't know whether a lot of people support that idea, but I thought that was interesting because Basque is a very old language. So I sometimes pick names from lists of Basque names just because they're old and pre-Indo-European. As for the characters, you have to imagine what life is like without the culture that we are surrounded by, and that's difficult because we're surrounded by it. It's like water for fish. They haven't discovered it because it's all around them. But I think that the things that people need are the things people have always needed. I heard them described once as the 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating. And basically,
sorry, it took me a second.
Yeah, I know. I was waiting for it.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to take another break. My brain was clearly not quite catching up with the words that Rob was speaking. So hopefully you got it a little quicker than I did. If you still haven't gotten it, think about it over the break, and we'll come back with more of the interview with Rob. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am still smiling over the conversation before the break, so I hope you are as well. I love that, just sort of subtle, he delivered it so well, didn't he? Very nicely done, Rob, I have to say, on the delivery. So deadpan. I don't know if you said that joke before, but you do it well. So anyway, let's go ahead and return to the interview with Rob.
That human life is based on fundamental needs and aspirations, and how you survive in a world where you have to follow and find the food. You're going to learn when the salmon are running and when the reindeer are migrating. You're going to learn all those things, and you're going to be able to coordinate it with the moon. And some of the earliest artifacts that we have created by people are just what are called batons. They're just a piece of bone or ivory with dots carved, holes carved in it. And if you count them up, they look like they're lunar cycles. So people were creating kind of early calendars as a way of coordinating when you moved. Because somebody had to decide, okay, it's fall, we got to move south. And it was probably more cooperative than having a chief. Most ethnographic material I've read about hunter-gatherers today suggests that their societies were pretty egalitarian, even though there was this division of labor between males and females. They still were probably not hierarchical. There were necessities of child rearing, particularly for very young children, that men just, I'm afraid, can't do. So women have that responsibility. And so foraging is a more natural activity for the females than hunting, which is much more solitary. It's something they can do socially with the children. But aside from that division, I think that every band raised every child. And that's now called, I understand, cooperative breeding or alloparenting. And that just means that it's not necessarily the biological parents who do all the care for the nuclear family, It's funny that the nuclear family came up with nuclear weapons. I'm not sure that anybody called it a nuclear family before that. So the culture is different. So if you get yourself into the mindset of being in a band where that's your family, basically, even if they're not related to you, and that the family, that the band borders were permeable, that is, you would encounter another band, have a nice feast or a social event of some kind, and swap people. So the bands would be fluid, and you would have adventures with somebody else. I think is a very different way of being in and with the world than what we have now, where what I call homes are enclosed, and I'm sitting here in a room full of books. The world was much more open, but you didn't have roads that lead from one place to another. You navigated the landscape by what Peter Wilson, anthropologist, calls focal points. You know, a mountain peak, a big stone, a huge tree, a river junction, a shoreline, and so on. And that it's a much more, probably by and large, a more sound permeated world, because vision is constrained by forests. If you're in forest, which a lot of people were until we cut them down. So you just get inside that, and then you try to imagine, well, what happens if somebody acts badly? What does a band do? So there's some stories about how people handle a bad actor. There are things like long distance trade in shells from the ocean, for instance, which are really interesting. They're very ancient snail shells in Africa that are very easy to drill through, and they find the same shell drilled, I think, tens of thousands of years ago, all the way from the top of Africa to the bottom, the same species of snail. So there's a kind of sense of a common culture, yet these individual bands that spend most of their time apart from others. And I love getting into that and seeing what that was like. When you get to the settlement and you're in a concentrated place for at least probably through the winter, it creates a very different kind of cultural context and a different kind of social relationship between males and females. So you get different mating patterns. You get different ideas about what it means to be a parent. When you have people settled in one place in a permanent house, you have to worry about who's going to get the house when you die, which means creating a sense of identification with the building, a sense of continuity of a family from one generation to the next, which creates a sense of linear time, very different from the circular time that you probably had before with the cycles of the seasons and the months and the days. And that's just a different experience. So what are the things that are important to people there? And then you get into a full-blown agricultural context where you've got farms and furrows, straight lines. And I got very interested in what I called the hegemony of the straight line. The dominance in our world today, if you look around, you see straight lines everywhere, completely unnatural. Mm-hmm. We have created a different universe in which we live. We have created it and we live in it. And some people get very uneasy when they go out into the woods because it's not straight. It's all tangled up. It's fractal. And yet kind of exciting.
Yeah, unless you don't like, unless you're just completely freaked out by that.
Yes, well, it's
well,
unsettling. It's
yeah.
unsettling, and I just read a story about a guy in Southern California who got lost hiking in a place that he knew really well, and he got trapped there, and his cell phone was dying, and he managed to send a text to somebody with a photograph of his feet. And some guy who likes to do this sort of thing, read a tweet about it and got out his satellite maps and located generally where the guy was and told the Forest Service, and they found him.
Oh, wow.
So we have this extension of our sensory systems now that go to satellites and help us kind of navigate that uncertain world of the wilderness. It's amazing, and it's very science fiction-y, and I like that too.
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking of science fiction-y, kind of fantasy-esque, this is not your first book. You have written others. I'm looking on your website, and that you have the Lisa Emmer series, and that sounds a little bit similar to what we've been talking about. It's 3,000-year-old Sumerian. Can you talk a little bit about that series and how it has been defined by some of your other research and work?
Sure. I'll tell you honestly, the series began must have been around 2009. I had an apartment in Paris for several years, and I went there, and somebody had left a copy of the Da Vinci Code in the apartment, and I was jet lagged, so I read it in one sitting, and it infuriated me, partly because it was such a page turner and so badly written. But I thought I could do that, and so just for fun, I sat down and said, okay, I'm going to start with chapter 1. And an important old person is murdered in a bizarre way. So I wrote a chapter where, and it turned in, and it sort of took over as a story. So the first book in the series was called The Delphi Agenda. And the premise was that the oracle at Delphi, which was closed by Theodosius the Great in 395, actually continued underground, and there's this war between the Catholic Church and the Delphi Agenda. Then I was one of my periodic obsessions with Sumerian. I was sitting in graduate class at Berkeley on Sumerian, reading Sumerian language, and thought I would just invent a tablet and create a story that would be the second in the series. I've just finished the third in the series, and it's much more climate oriented. So I think that everything feeds into whatever. And it's interesting that it became a series because a lot of people told me there was no interest in books like this, but it's actually my revenue stream.
Well, clearly there's interest in books like this because others have done well, and because yours is doing well. So that's interesting. I love how situational your writing is. You were jet lagged, so you read a book. You said, I can do that. And as I'm looking through the description of the book, there's parts that take place in Paris. I just love kind of take pieces of wherever you are at the moment. That's awesome.
I don't think there are any Delphi Agenda tours of Paris yet, but
hey, give it time.
We'll give it time.
Yeah. Are there any of your other writings that you would like to highlight as well?
Oh, I'm actually publishing a lot of short stories, but most of them are old, and I'm getting them published because I'm lazy. So I hired somebody to submit them for me, and she's doing quite well. I did a book in 1981, I think, called The Book of Revelations. which was it was a transition book because my first 3 books were satire, kind of Vonnegut science fiction satire. And this one was a transition book, and it was about the place where I ended up doing as a futurist, working as a futurist. And that was an accidental meeting in an Aikido class with somebody who worked there. And I wrote this sort of new age science fiction book called The Book of Revelations. And it did not do very well, but something weird happened last year, I guess 2 years ago now. Yeah, before the plague. A professor at Yale got a hold of me, and he'd stumbled over the book and he wanted to teach it. So because the class then was on Zoom, I got to sit in. He did 3 classes on it, and it was fascinating because I had to read it again. And actually, I discovered that I liked it. So I might recommend that. It's available. It covers a lot of my obsessions.
I'll just interject to say that is fascinating. I would imagine that you would have had to read it again. You know, we're going back to a book 40 years later that.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating.
Almost terrifying. But I was pleased, and the students seemed to like it. So it's about the future, about thinking about the future, and about I at that time had postulated 3 peaks of intelligence on the planet. Those were humans, dolphins, and elephants. And I got to spend again. This is all accidental. Knew somebody, and I got a backstage pass to Marine World, which was in Redwood City at that time. And I got to get to know some of the animals, including the dolphins and the elephants. I think I would be against places like that now, but at the time it was awesome. And there was research going on with dolphin communication at the time. So it was fascinating to me. I've recently gotten very interested in cephalopods, particularly octopuses, and have managed to wangle some trips into places where I could meet some, although not that intimately because they live underwater. But alien intelligence is now something that we can actually interact with. And I think the movie My Octopus Teacher is a good example of how we can begin to understand that there are other kinds of intelligence besides ours. And maybe we should be more careful about how we exterminate species, because we may be killing our neighbors.
Okay, last break of the podcast. When we come back, Rob will be giving his advice for aspiring authors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Rob Swigart.
In terms of your own experience with writing you've done a lot of different kinds of writing. Would you have advice for aspiring authors?
When I was in graduate school, somebody said the best advice for writing is to hit the keys of the typewriter one at a time, because otherwise they tend to jam up. And I thought at the time that was actually really good advice, because it suggests that you just have to keep writing.
Right.
And
but that's
and you have to love to love doing it.
Yeah. But now I'm wondering how many people actually get that reference.
Yeah, that's a problem now. But there's still enough people who remember typewriters, I guess.
Yeah.
My first book was done on a typewriter, and my second book was done on a computer. And it was, I think it was an Apple II. Yeah, late 70s.
Wow, very cool.
So that transition happened a long time ago now.
Mhm.
And yet, people didn't believe in it. I remember one writer telling me that he didn't like mice. and we didn't get mice until 1984. So
yeah.
And he still didn't like mice. He didn't like computers. He wanted to work with a typewriter. So I think a lot of writers just hung on. But I was always jumping into technology and doing. That's why I did technical writing for Apple in the 80s, just so I could learn about the technology.
Yeah.
I'm not arguing that we should all become hunter-gatherers again. We can't. There's not enough wilderness left, and we're not going to get 8 billion people out there hunting giraffes.
No. But please no. There are definite lessons to be learned from our history and our past, and I think it doesn't do well to just have this mindset of, well, we just keep moving forward. We don't need to look back. We don't need to see where we came from. Well, of course we do, because everything we're doing now is built on everything that came before.
Yeah, I think it's Churchill who said, the farther back we look in the past, the farther ahead we can look into the future. I think we need to. I used to describe it as if you take a cone and you take the point of the cone and you say that's now, then the future is a cone that expands out ahead of us and becomes more and more diffuse and uncertain. And the same thing with the past. If you take now as the point of the cone looking into the past gets fuzzier and fuzzier as it goes back. But there's a little bit of overlap with the 2 points of the cones. So, and that's kind of near-term memory and immediate future planning. And I think that the more we exercise our brains to look farther in each direction, the more fit we are to navigate the present, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think so.
So my advice for aspiring authors is be curious about everything and keep typing. You have to just keep typing. Yeah.
Yep.
Hit the keys one at a time, and make sure they make words.
Right. Right. Because I can just hit keys and see what happens.
We could do that, but that's an infinite number of monkeys on an infinite number of typewriters. So,
yes, Shakespeare, all that good stuff.
We cannot be infinite.
No.
Unfortunately.
No. When you take the time to read for yourself as opposed to reading for research or something specific, do you have favorite authors and genres that you turn to?
I read Twain, I read Dickens. I went through, as it turned out, I inherited a bunch of Aldous Huxley novels from my parents, and I've read all of those now. So I read a lot of 19th century classics, and I studied Japanese for a while in the 70s, and I have read The Tale of Genji probably 5 times. And I can always read the Odyssey, and I still have this new translation of the Odyssey to read. I read it to both my daughters when they were little, and I think it's probably one of the greatest stories ever told. So, yeah, I'll go back and read them, but I also go back and read poetry, particularly now that I'm a little bit longer in the tooth. The Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. I think Old Men Should Be Explorers is one of the great tidbits of advice you can give somebody old. I do read science fiction, and I've written a science fiction climate change book, and which is looking for a market. And I'm going to write, and my next book will be the second volume in that series. And briefly, I'll describe it because I think it was an important thing, and I came up with a one-sentence description of it. What happens when a planet that avoided avoided climate change and by avoiding agriculture is invaded by a planet that wants to convert it to agriculture? And so it's from the point of view of the planet that's being invaded, which is a planet of hunter-gatherers, and why, and the people, the invaders, of course, are us. And I wanted to, describe what I thought was one possible future, which is avoiding the abyss of agriculture, which has basically changed the world in ways that can't be reversed. And when we have done that, what can we do? So the second volume is now one of the people from that planet on Earth to see if he can help them avoid the dire consequences they face. And I think that it's just interesting to think about what we might do, various options we might have going forward from where we are now. So that's kind of what I'm exploring.
Mm-hmm.
And,
all right.
Yeah.
And now there's that whole new genre that I just learned about recently, which is cli-fi. So you even have
cli-fi. That's what it is. It's cli-fi.
Yep.
They will both be cli-fi.
You don't have to invent a new genre. It's already there for you.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's been there for a while. I mean, I recently read a late 19th century French novel called Man Underground. It's by a thinker, sort of end of the 19th, early 20th century, whose name is Gabriel, I forget. And it's the sun basically goes out. It stops, and some people manage to move underground, and they go down into these tunnels, and they carve out a place to live, and they've got plenty of food because all they have to do is tunnel up, and everything up there is frozen. So there's this huge deep freeze full of animals, and they develop art and spend all their time either appreciating art or making art. And it's kind of ideal in a weird way. And I think of that as a kind of climate fiction, although I'm not sure that's what he intended it to be, since it was so early. But the interest in this has been a long time with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Rob, I know you have a website, so if you can share your website as well as where people might be able to interact with you on any kinds of social media.
Okay, that's a good one. The website is just Rob Swigart, ROBSWIGART.com, and there are links for all the books and other information. I think that my email address is on there. I think that the one that has is robswigart.com. robswigart.com, rob@robswigart.com. And the best way to interact with me is either through that or I'm on LinkedIn, and I sometimes respond to people on that. But email's the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay. I
have publicly removed myself from Facebook. And
yeah.
I'm sorry, but I will not participate in that much evil.
Mhm. Well, I mean, everybody needs to make those decisions for themselves. So.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
We have talked about a lot of things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to mention at this point?
Well, I think that I can talk at length about my obsessions with climate and the bad things we've done, but I'm trying to be more open to possible benefits, and I did one story about a future city, but it was most of the well, first of all, I was at a meeting at the place I was doing the climate research for a client, a big meeting, and I got up and announced that climate change was the existential threat that was facing mankind, and that if we didn't do something about it, we were going to be in bad shape, although I used a more expressive term, perhaps. And in the intermission, a guy came up to me from the CDC and said, our major problem is we have 5 billion too many people. And that got me thinking about population, which is another way we've exceeded the capacity. And of course, the technology enthusiasts will say that technology will always solve our food problems and that Malthus was wrong and we're not going to starve. But with climate change, we're beginning to see how the globe is changing and how agriculture is beginning to fail and monoculture is bad for us. So I think that people need to be aware and they need to start thinking about it in important ways and seeing how polarized this country has become. I sometimes despair, but I'm not going to stop haranguing people about it. So if you want a 2 or 3 hour lecture, I can get going, but I don't think you want that.
Probably not for the podcast, but
not today. No.
Not today. That's right. Well, thank you so much, Rob. I have really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me not only about mixed harvest, but about so many other topics. It's been great.
It's been my pleasure, Sarah. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you once again to Rob for joining me to talk about Mixed Harvest, Stories from the Human Past. I hope that if you are a fan of anthropology, historical fiction, archaeology, short stories, any of those, that you will check out this book. It is a really fascinating way to approach this period, this phase of human development, and I really appreciated the way it blends the nonfiction and the fiction, the short stories, kind of making it into almost a novel, not quite the way you might expect the arc of a novel to go, but really interesting. So if you are, like I said, a fan of any of those areas, you should definitely check out this book. Again, Mixed Harvest, Stories from the Human Past. So thank you, Rob, for joining me. Thank you, as always, for joining me to listen to authors talk about their books and talk about their writing, give advice on writing, all of those fun things. I hope that you will join me again for the next episode when I will be speaking to returning guest, not Marco Ockrum. No, the man who represents Marco Ockrum. We will be speaking with Dennis Shaughnessy about his latest Marco Ockrum book. It's a prequel, so it's the third book, but also the first book, because why wouldn't it be? It's Marco. And this one is called The Awful Truth About the Herbert Quarry Affair. If you didn't tune into that first episode with Dennis, you should, because I can't even begin to explain to you the craziness that is Marco Ockrum and these books. So you should check that out. And then definitely join me for the next interview, the next episode, and you can hear more about, well, not more about Marco's ongoing story, but you get a little bit more of his backstory and where all the craziness started. Dennis is always a lot of fun to chat with. If you like a good Liverpudlian accent, then that's even more reason to tune in, as that is where he hails from. So join me next time for that. In the meantime, again, hope your Tuesday's going well. Hope you had a great weekend, that your week is off to a great start, and then that week involves plenty of time for you to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.